I believe it's time for a constitution in the UK, a written constitution, with a clause to protect our right to unrestricted free speech. Common law, which has to date been our guarantee of free speech, is no longer sufficient, and it's actually been used to silence people for a number of reasons which I'll go into. However, with recent events, particularly the arrest, detention and deportation of 3 foreign conservatives trying to enter the UK over the weekend, namely Sellner and Brittany Pettibone and Martin Sellner, our Home Secretary, Amber Rudd MP, has only succeeded in highlighting not only the causes which they represent, which is not necessarily a bad thing at all, but also the massive assault on the freedom of speech currently underway in the UK, which apparently appears to be being led by the Conservative government. Since the Friday, when we became knowledge that Martin and Brittany had been deported, and Sunday, when it became evident that Lauren had been deported, there's been a whole storm on social media. Obviously, nothing really in the mainstream media, but a whole storm on social media about this. And in many of the comment sections, there are quite vociferous and quite sort of challenging comments by our American cousins, castigating the UK population, of whom I am a member, and for not standing up for our rights and for not standing up for freedom of speech. And they have a point. They have a very good point. Like all things, however, it's not quite as simple as that, and I'll go into those details now. So this is essentially a video which is my attempt to answer that criticism, which is very valid, I think, in some aspects, and explain why this is happening and why it's not being challenged, and why British people are being silent on this, and why they need to stand up actually and start to say something. So before I go on, I'd like to say welcome to the video. I'm very grateful that you clicked on it, and I hope you get some value from it. If you disagree with anything or you want more information about anything, please feel free to enter it into the comment section below. I'm not sure if it's turned into a series of videos. It might do, but we'll wait and see about that. However, I just thought it was about time I added to the conversation. There's a lot of stuff online about this issue across places like Canada and America, where I think you're probably further down the line, slightly differently culturally though. And there aren't that many videos or articles out there which are addressing the specific problem that we have in the UK, which I'll go into. Okay, so without further ado, I'd also like to apologise for the quality of the equipment I'm using. As you can see, I'm just on my MacBook, and I'm using the FaceTime thingy camera, which is why we've got this overexposed light coming in from the window. I don't have any makeup or anything, and I'm using one of these wireless microphones. So excuse any woofing. The dog's in the room, and he's a bit stupid, and he barks at lots of noises outside. Anyway, I will kick on. So before we get into why this has happened, I think we need to have a quick understanding of what rights in the UK are, and the history of those rights, and how they came about. So rights in the UK, well, the history of rights in the UK and the nations that form the Union, which are England, Scotland, Wales, and now Northern Ireland. It used to be Ireland, obviously. Goes back to the days of King John of England. So we're talking about way back in the very early 1200s. In fact, 1218 was the date when. 1218. 1216 was the date when Magna Carta was written. Which was one of the first examples of the state being, the form of the monarch, being forced to guarantee the rights of his subjects under law. Now, there were certain elements that in the English legal code which go back before those times, and key to the rights of the individual in the UK is English common law. Now, it's sort of slightly galls me to say that because I am a Scotsman. Well, at least a large part of me is Scottish. And obviously in Scotland we have a different legal system. However, Acts of Parliament that are passed and have been passed in 1707 are merely converted into Scottish law. So to all intents and purposes, English common law basically applies across the UK with some sort of differences in procedure and in how you get there, and also in the types of verdict you can get. English common law was a code that developed from Anglo-Saxon tribal law, which was originally developed around discussing property rights, etc., of members of a tribe or an area. It was developed by several medieval kings, particularly Edward I of England, and common law has always been used, particularly in modern days, so since the 18th century, really, to be the guarantor of rights in the UK, and it, to an extent, replaces the idea of a written constitution, like you have, for instance, the United States or in one of the European countries. So here's how it basically works, right? As a British subject or citizen, we call them citizens these days, we used to be subjects, but now citizens, you have all the rights there are under common law. Now, these are natural rights which you're born with, and they're not to be confused with human rights, which are granted to a citizen by the state. Right? In common law, rights in common law are individually, not group held. And that's quite important because we hear a lot about group rights at the moment. We don't have group rights under common law. We have individual rights. And the rights under common law are not for the state to grant or remove. So the basic idea is you have all the rights there are until your rights come up against someone else's rights. And when that happens, the court system decides who has the right of it. Now, on the whole, this system served Britain pretty well for the last 800 odd years. And over that time, it's become increasingly refined. The criminal justice system and courts in this country exist to protect the individual from the power of the state and to ensure that due process is followed, fair trials, etc. And over the centuries, as the idea of an autocratic monarch became redundant and was eventually overthrown during a century of very bloody civil wars, the English Civil War, which is also known as the War of Nations because it actually involved the entire of the British Isles, and the 1716 and 1745 Jacobite rebellions, which were both civil wars. These weren't necessarily rebellions. These were existential fights between the idea of the supremacy of kings, represented by the Stuart claimants, and the supremacy of Parliament, which was represented by the government Hanoverian forces. Jacobite rebellions get painted with a lot of romance. There was a very good reason why we fought them, and we would not be the country we are today had the Stuarts won. We'd most likely be a republic, which might actually solve all the problems we're in at the moment. So, that's such is history. So it's important to understand how bloody these wars were, and particularly what we call the English Civil War. Nearly a quarter to 1/3 of the population of England perished during that period as a result of that war, through famine, disease, and all the other wonderful things that warfare brings, especially civil war, which tends to be particularly vicious and nasty. By the mid-18th century, Britons had begun to realise that this was an unsustainable way to resolve their political differences. Several instances, including the 1697 execution in Edinburgh of student Thomas Aikenhead for blasphemy. Essentially, Thomas Aikenhead was a student. He'd been out on the swally, as we call it in Scotland. So he'd been out for a few drinks, and he got a bit pissed. And in the middle of his drunkenness, he got on his high horse in one of the many taverns in Edinburgh at the time, and started ranting about the authority of the Church of Scotland, also known as the Kirk, and the elders who ran the Kirk. And Scotland at the time was essentially a fundamentalist religious state, and you just didn't do this. But this was also a time when we were beginning to see the power of the church being wound back considerably. And it was the dawn of the Enlightenment, which was particularly virulent in Scotland, particularly in Edinburgh. And when Aikenhead was arrested and very vindictively tried and executed extremely quickly, actually. I think it was about it all happened in the space of about 4 days, by the authorities in Scotland. It appalled the intellectual classes in Edinburgh and beyond, and absolutely appalled them. And if anything, this is one of the things that sparked the Scottish intellectuals to start the Enlightenment, to remove thus from the era of superstition and vindictive religious fundamentalism. So throughout the 18th century, we see Edinburgh and London in particular become centres of renaissance and thought. And one of the pillars of the Enlightenment was the idea of embracing the ancient humanists of Greek and Rome, and in particular Socrates' and Socratic method, which, of course, the fundamental idea of is the idea of freedom of speech. Socrates died for his freedom of speech. And this was seized upon by the likes of Burke and Payne to become the battle flag of the American colonists when they took umbrage at the heavy-handed way the British Crown was treating its American colonies. Free speech, it appeared, was all right for the enlightened classes of the mother country, but it wasn't tolerable in the uppity colonists. So, and we know what happened next: revolution, American independence, the writing of the American Constitution, and there is no mistake that free speech became enshrined as the First Amendment to that Constitution. Meanwhile, back in Blighty, we were up to our arms in an existential battle with firstly the forces of Jacobinism and revolution in France, and then with the Emperor Napoleon, who could be argued to be the first iteration of European Union oligarchy. The Napoleonic Wars, which ended in an Allied victory in 1815, were very much a battle of ideals. Those were the two sides were the bottom-up democracy that had been emerging in Britain, where the idea was the governments exist to serve the people. Well, the people meant the landowning classes, because only they had a vote, and was answerable to them. People sent their MPs to Parliament, and the MPs drafted law in response to the mood and demands of the public. The Napoleonic system, which is sometimes known as Bonapartism, which has a much more in common with Plato's republics, is the idea of a philosophy king with a highly educated and intelligent coterie of ministers reporting to the philosopher king or emperor, i.e. Napoleon, would draft legislation, and the French Senate, which is elected, votes on whether or not to approve legislation. The Senate itself had pretty much no power to draft laws itself. And the difference between these two forms, on just a slight segue, the difference between these two forms and traditions of government is my theory as to why the UK, with its Anglo-American bottom-up democracy model, was never going to work with the European Union's essentially Bonapartist system, where an intellectual elite makes all the decisions, and they're made by unelected officials whose laws can only be approved of or disapproved by an elected parliament. So that's a very brief sort of summary as to where we are by 1815. And 1815 is a massive year for Britain. Boney, Napoleon, having packed off St Helena, he'd lost the Battle of Waterloo. The Bourbon monarchy was restored in France for the second time, and Britain is sat as the only world power with an empire based on trade and protected and forced by a formidable and proven battle fleet. But back at home, all was not well. Soldiers and sailors pressed into service from the working, industrial, and agricultural classes found themselves thrown onto the beach. And this is key. It wasn't just the working classes who found themselves on the beach, but their officers. The army and navy were often destinations for the second, and third, and fourth sons of the gentry to pursue their careers, as they would not get any form of inheritance or landed inheritance, and they relied on the services for their income, and they suddenly found that their services were no longer required. They'd be put on half pay or dropped completely. So essentially, you've got a situation where there's no provision for the veterans, especially the wounded veterans from these 23 years of brutal warfare against France, and for the officers, many of them were facing ruin, financial ruin, and a life of poverty. Now, at the same time, you had an industrial revolution which had started about 40 years earlier, and whose social consequences had to an extent been postponed by the 23 years of war. And after the war, this sort of started to have an effect on society. It had all been building up for the period of the war, where the government had sort of fairly strict rules on protest, etc., because we were at war. So the end of the war also brought the end of the war economy. Employment collapsed. There was now a large proletariat in industrial cities, many of whom had grown from small villages to large cities within the space of a couple of decades. And this was combined with the artificially high price of grain and therefore the high price of bread, the staple. That's one of the reasons why potatoes are so popular in Britain, is because of the Corn Law from 1815 to 1846, which set the price of grain at an artificially high level, which was designed to protect landowners' profits and keep foreign imports out of Britain. It had a huge social impact on the poor and needy. And this was one of the main reasons which started to produce demands for political change and greater suffrage across the country. And what followed was a 30-year struggle to do so, and it resulted in several acts of parliament, two of which were the Great Reform Act of 1832, which was essentially the starting point of modern British Parliament in its recognisable form today, but also the eventual repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846. The struggle was very tough. Our ancestors went through a lot to get this, and most of us, like to think we're descended from the aristocratic families you'll see in period dramas. But the bottom line is most of us, even if we are descended from them, we're also descended from people who were struggling in the ironworks and coal mines and in the agricultural fields at the time, and we're having a pretty shit life. And we should not forget what our ancestors did in the struggle for the vote and for democracy and for freedom of speech. And there were several incidents where the power of the state was used to protect the status quo at the time. They were worried about the spectre of evolution on the continent and tended to crack down very hard on any sort of dissent or protest at all. It's a bit like today, really. The particularly notorious event was the Peterloo Massacre, which happened on the 16th of August, 1891, where 60,000 protesters on Peterloo Fields, which I think is just outside Birmingham, which is now inside Birmingham, because obviously Birmingham is much bigger, were demanding political representation, and they were actually charged by the local yeomanry militia, which are cavalry, horse soldiers, albeit part-time ones, with sabres drawn. It resulted in the death of about 15 protesters, and nearly 700 of them were injured. And we also saw at the time detention and deportation for life of political rights activists like the Tolpuddle Martyrs, who were campaigning for employment rights, basic employment rights that today we take for granted. So for those who actually are tearing their hair out and bemoaning the leaving of the EU to be the end of life as we know it, and in particular employment rights for British workers, that's just absolute bollocks. It was the reason why we have employment rights as British workers is because of what people like the Tolpuddle Martyrs went through 150 years ago. Anyway, I'm going off track, and I'm not going to go into details here, as this video is actually about the current situation. But it's important that you understand the background. So by the 20th century, Britain's empire was at its greatest extent, and it was on the turn. It's worth understanding that Britain's empire sort of happened by accident. It wasn't like, back in the Elizabethan times, somebody said, right, we're going to have an empire and we're going to conquer the world. I think when you're playing Total War Empire, it's often you start to conflate what's happening on a computer game with what actually history was. Many in Britain didn't actually want an empire. Gladstone, the famous Liberal Prime Minister, was especially opposed to it as a zero-sum game. The whole point originally had been to have a trading empire to break the monopoly of Spain and its ability to bring gold out of the New World. And it wasn't to have an empire that required military and civil expense, despite the claims of the modern revisionists. It wasn't about that; it was about ripping off and exploiting raw material from colonies, and that did happen in some cases. The empire, by the early 20th century, was costing an awful lot more to maintain than it made. In that way, Britain was a bit like the United States is in modern times. It was sort of trapped in maintaining it because, for all its faults, the empire saw the 19th century as the most peaceful in the history of the world, or in world history anyway. and certainly a lot more peaceful than the catastrophe of the 20th century or some of the wars and bloodshed of the 18th century with its various conflicts. And you don't even want to go down to what the 17th century was like. Obviously, by the 20th century, you suddenly see a militaristic Germany on the rise. Italy's new state, both looking for imperial gain, often at the expense of a restored but creaking France, who had seen themselves beaten in the Franco-Prussian War, and not to forget a highly expansionist power in Tsarist Russia. And Britain couldn't walk away from its commitments, which was essentially to maintain the balance of power and thus guarantee world peace and create a balance book that went some way to paying for the empire through trade. And of course, this ended up with Britain being dragged into the First World War again, not, as the 1960s historical revisionists tell us, a pointless war designed to punish the working class. It was actually a war fought against a highly militaristic and aggressive Germany. And Britons volunteered for it because they knew Germany was highly militaristic and aggressive. This was a war fought from the British side for ideals. By 1939, the empire was definitely on the wane, and the existential war of 39 to 45 effectively burst the blister. Now, in 1945, we saw exactly the same demands for political reform as we saw at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Not so much World War I, because there was such a carnage, I think, of working men. And we see the first socialist government in Britain, the nationalisation of industries, the start of the welfare state, and the socialisation of healthcare and the foundation of national service. All sounds like very humane stuff back then, but obviously now we are trying to cope with the consequences of that in a whole number of different ways, both societal, legal, and economic. Up until the mid-1980s, our rights had been protected by common law, and this served us pretty well. And we had got away without having a written constitution. Britain was run on a sort of gentleman's agreement where the crown, which is an idea really, doesn't refer to the monarch, which was separate from the government and the forces of, so you have the crown over here, the government over here, the forces of law, order, judiciary and armed forces all answer to the crown, not to the government. And this meant the court system was a check on the state power, and it did work pretty well. However, from the mid-1980s, we began to see the introduction of a number of pieces of legislation that began to eat away in increments at the rights of British people. As is always the case, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and such laws were justified to protect the public from various threats like the IRA and loyalist Irish terrors. And also, we mustn't forget that the spectre of the communist bloc, because we were in the Cold War, and the heart of the Cold War was always at the back of the minds. And as somebody who grew up and lived through the Cold War from 1971 through to 1991, this was very much at the forefront of our minds at the time. I think it's difficult to understand exactly what it was like living through the Cold War if you didn't actually live through it. But what we begin to see by some of these changes is a slight blurring between the idea of crown and government. And the crown starts to act for the government rather than being a check on the government. So there's another thing going on here, which was that prior to 1914, British people had far more rights than they had today. During the First World War and again during the Second World War, rights were taken by the government and for the security of the nation. But after the war, they weren't given back. And it's a very good example of how the state is quite happy to take rights from the population and makes all sorts of arguments why it needs to happen, but then gets very used to having these powers and doesn't want to give them up. And oh my word, as we are seeing with this freedom of speech issue we've got in the United Kingdom, so vividly brought into focus by what happened to Lauren and what happened to Martin and to Brittany, that proves how difficult it is to get these laws back. And we've tied ourselves in knots, and I'll go into why that is now. So we often hear the term hate speech law bandied around. We don't actually have a hate speech law in Britain. We've actually got a number of different acts of parliament, all of which are pretty complicated. So the real bits of legislation you have to watch out for are the Public Order Act 1986, specifically Section 4A, which was added in 1994, the Crime and Disorder Act 1998, the Serious Organised Crime Police Act 2005, and what I believe is probably one of the most pernicious of them all, which is the Religious and Racial Hatred Act of 2006. So the bill, essentially the Religious and Racial Hatred Act 2006 contains some specific wording that effectively makes it very, very difficult for anybody in Britain to criticize a religion. So Section 29A of the amendment, which is to the Public Order Act 86, gives specifically says the meaning of religious hatred. In this part, religious hatred means hatred against a group of persons divided by reference to religious belief or lack of religious belief. And Section 29B is a person who uses threatening words or behavior or displays any written material which is threatening is guilty of an offence if he intends thereby to stir up religious hatred. So that's the nub of it. That is essentially the hate speech law, which protects religion, which is what's used to silence the debate on Islam. Now, Tony Blair's government tried to get this written into law on 4 different occasions and was eventually forced to amend it by the House of Lords, who forced it back to the Commons, where the government lost a vote. And the amendment forced the government to have to prove intent. So therefore, the state, the prosecution, has to prove that the person intended to use, it intended to stir up religious hatred. So it gives it gives some protection, but not an awful lot. However, as I'll come on to it, there's a big skeleton in the cupboard here. Now, it's this law that have been the most pernicious because it effectively kills free speech in the UK, in particular Section 3A, which is a person who uses threatening words or behaviour or displays any written material which is threatening is guilty of an offence if he intends thereby to stir up religious hatred. So once they've added the word intent, it doesn't really change anything. The problem's still there. What is threatening words or behaviour? Define that. How do we define that? Now, Section 29J was actually added to this after quite a substantial campaign. And it actually states this very clearly. Nothing in this part shall be read or given effect in a way that prohibits or restricts discussion, criticism, or expressions of antipathy, dislike, ridicule, insult, or abuse of particular religions or the beliefs or practices of their adherents, or of any other belief system or the beliefs or practices of its adherents, or proselytizing or urging adherents of a different religion or belief system to cease practicing their religion or belief system. So, when you read that, which is the bit of the act that is meant to guarantee our freedom of speech and our ability to criticize and criticize Scientology, Islam, Christianity, whatever religion you want to criticize, you scratch your head when you think about what happened to Lawrence Southern the other day in Calais, where they accused her of spreading racial hatred by handing leaflets that ridicule, insult, and abused Islam. So they just changed, they just made something up. Oh, let's just call it racism. Never mind the fact that Islam is not a religion that has any racial element to it whatsoever. So now, this is the big problem, and this is the why, my American friends, we have this problem in the UK. Because we haven't got a written constitution, and because we rely on common law, which grants us all the rights and then leaves it to the courts to decide the right of it, the police and the state are quite happy to use legislation that was never intended to be used to silence people to silence people. So you get this ambiguity. So the police know there's the ambiguity there. They know that if they arrest Count Dankula, for instance, who has been dragged through the courts for 2 years for making a comedy video poking fun at Nazis by teaching his pet pug the Roman, or the Nazi salute. This caused great offence to somebody in the Jewish community, who reported them to the police in Scotland, and the Fiscal Service, which is the prosecution service in Scotland, decided to prosecute Mark, aka Count Dankula, and they have, for the last 2 years, been dragging him through the courts. So while Section J allows Mark to legally criticise a religion, the police can still arrest you, and the Crown Prosecution Service or Fiscal Service in Scotland can still drag you into court, even though they know damn fine that you're protected by Section 29J. Now, the reason why they do this is because the court system in the UK at the moment is massively overburdened and underfunded. If you are arrested and charged, even if the prosecutors know there is no chance for conviction, they know it will have a massive impact on you and your family life, job, stress levels, and finances. Take Count Dankula's case as an example. He's been to court on 3 occasions, every time the prosecution brings up another offence, and the case is adjourned, often for up to 6 months because the courts are so busy. This month he faces 4th visits to court, and throughout all of this is the threat of being jailed for up to 5 years. Now, and while this is going on, he's unable to find employment because he has to declare to his employers if he's been found guilty or is under criminal prosecution. And that also, by turn, means he's unable to find a specialist solicitor. In other words, the police, the state, the fiscal service are using the inefficiency of the process of justice as a punishment in itself before Count Dankula has been tried and found guilty. And they are doing this consciously and deliberately. This culture of punishment through process is exactly what we saw in Lawrence Southern's arrest in Calais on Sunday. Lawrence Southern's arrest in Calais on Sunday. I'm getting my words tangled. So in asking her to hand over her phone, they tried to intimidate her by explaining the deeply intrusive and evasive process they would go through to secure her phone, access to her phone, which included being detained for another 7 days, undergoing body searches, blah-de-blah-de-blah. Thereby, the process becomes the punishment. The process is a threat. Give us the password to your phone, or we're going to give you an internal examination. Where's the rubber gloves? Fortunately, she told them where to stick it, and the police didn't try that one on. They didn't try it on because they knew damn fine that she wasn't a terrorist, and they were being very dodgy in using the Terrorism Act to try and detain her, but that's for a different story. So what we also see is that every time that the state asks for special powers to allow it to ignore the rights and due process for our protection, we are assured that the burden of proof will have to be high, and we are often told that it will be the Secretary of State or a senior judge that will have oversight. But time and time again, we see ministers and the police, as did the police with Lauren on Sunday, abuse these powers. They granted the Terrorist Act, which suspends all sorts of rights that we have, habeas corpus, Magna Carta. It suspends the right to remain silent. It suspends the right to legal cover. You have to answer their questions legally. You're not allowed to stay silent. They get this power to protect us from clear and imminent terrorist attacks, where they've got to get somebody to spill the beans to stop people getting killed. And they use this for an excuse to stop somebody, to get them detained so they can't come into the country. That's not what the law's for. So, despite the fact that, oh yes, we need these special powers to protect us from terrorism, we'll just use them to terrorize, for the state to terrorize and intimidate and bully and silence anybody we don't want coming in. So this is the problem. Common law is there to protect our rights. We don't have a constitution. Common law is there to protect our freedom of speech. We don't have a constitution. Common law gives us all the rights until our rights come up against someone else, in this case Muslims or the far left, or the state. At which time we go to court, where the court decides who has the right of it. But by the time common law ends up protecting us by ruling in our favour, the horse has bolted. It's gone. You're already punished. Your finances are empty from hiring defence solicitors and not being able to work. Your reputation is in tatters due to the publication of details to partisan media and hostile and frothing far left who will really go for you. Your family life possibly over, all because you did, said, or asked something that the state wanted to silence. Now, this is why I think we need a written constitution. Whenever you bring this up to a lawyer in Britain, they'll usually poo-poo you and say, oh, no, our common law is this wonderful thing that's there to protect us. Well, it doesn't. It doesn't protect us because the very process of enacting common law, the very process of pressing the button and using common law as a defence punishes us. That's why. And the more you have in life, the better educated you are, the more you have in terms of property, the more you have in terms of career, the more prestige you have, the higher class you are, the higher social class you are, the higher financial wealth you have, the more you have to lose, the less likely you are to speak out. The very people who we need to speak out are intimidated into silence, because the costs of speaking out is not just being called a racist by the far left. It's been having your career, your freedom, your finances, and everything destroyed. Now, it's particularly on the onus of my generation to speak out, but my generation are the ones with children. It's interesting, when you look at the commentators on YouTube, or the British commentators on YouTube who comment about these sort of things, many of them, not all of them, but many of them are self-employed. The only reason why I can get away with making this video is because I'm self-employed. I'm not even sure what impact this is going to have on my clients. I run a consultancy business. I'm not sure if this is going to cost me some business. It probably will do, but it might win me some other business. Who knows? But this is the point, is that American cousins, it's not that we aren't able to speak out. We have exactly the same situation that you have in terms of the social stigmatism of speaking out. Okay? We're exactly in the same boat as you are on that. We're in the same boat of being crucified and smeared and slurred by the hard left. But in addition to that, because we haven't got a constitution to protect us, are in a situation where the state know damn fine they can use the inefficiency and complexity of the system around the rights that we have that define our limits of our speech to tie us up in legal battles that we just can't. We will probably win eventually. We'll probably win on the point, on the principle of it, but you'll end up with an empty cup. So the state knows exactly that to silence us on anything, particularly discussing or criticizing Islam, government policy in Islam, government policy in immigration, government policy in race, government policy in multiculturalism, anything perceived as far right or controversial by the government, all they have to do is initiate the process, because the pain of the process of justice is such that you will end up with a Pyrrhic victory, an empty victory cup. Now, this is one of the reasons why the British public have been so reluctant to speak out, as I've already said. And the other reason is that obviously we share with you guys around the rest of the world, which is, if anything, is more successful in stifling the debate by making it socially unacceptable. You can't say that. The culture of you can't say that. Now, on top of this, we have the other thing that's happening across the world, which is the insidious creep of a weaponization of language, the insidious creep of postmodernism and the weaponization of language. So this has happened at our universities as well as it has in Canada and America. But it's also, I think, happening over here, and I know it's very advanced in Canada, that government institutions and organizations are becoming increasingly corrupted by and owned with a narrative which has been completely written by a generation of people who've been educated by Marxist professors of the late 1960s, and they have weaponized words like racist, homophobe, and made up new ones like Islamophobe. We've seen this in Amber Rudd's statement when October 2017, when she said that those guilty of reading extremist material online or watching streaming videos of extremist nature or watching far-right videos online could face up to 15 years in prison. However, although she specifically mentioned far-right, she neglected to define either extremism or far-right. And I think this is very deliberate by Amber Rudd. Now, we've seen the court process used as punishment by the state, and we've seen this applied to people who the state wants to silence. Tommy Robinson's another good example. We already talked about Count Dunkula. Tommy's a very high-profile case. Now, neither Tommy or the Count are far-right, as in Nazis, British National Party, National Socialists. I always call them National Socialists and not Nazis to remind the socialists where National Socialism comes from. Now, Tommy Robinson is a working-class lad who objected to Islamists burning his country's flag and splitting on British soldiers returning from tours in Iraq and Afghanistan when they paraded through their hometown, which is Luton. As a working-class lad, he did what people do. He counter-protested. He got his friends together and he counter-protested. But because he's working class, and a lot of his fellow protesters are football, soccer fans, who are very much seen as scary, intimidating yobbos by the chattering classes. They were tarred as violent neo-Nazi yobs by the chattering socialists of The Guardian, Channel 4, BBC and others. And unfortunately, most unwoke people in the United Kingdom believe publications like The Guardian, Channel 4 and the BBC. They believe them. So once Tommy had been slurred as being a national socialist in the eyes of society, what followed was a decade of blatant and illegal police harassment. Now, racist is a hugely powerful word in British society. It doesn't matter what you've done. If you are racist, then you are the scum of the earth, according to British society. You could be Mother Teresa of bloody Calcutta, but if you're racist, it doesn't count for anything. If you crack a racist joke, that's it, you're screwed. And the majority of the British public probably still think that Tommy Robinson is racist, whereas if anyone actually takes the time to read his book, watch the speech he gave to the Oxford Union, who should be applauded when the Oxford Union asked Tommy to give a speech to explain himself to people and gave him a platform to do that at the Oxford University Students' Union, a debating union, in 2015. And this was at a time when it took a while for them to actually get the speech out because the police knew he was speaking at the Oxford Union and they went out of their way to ensure that he couldn't. And they did this by arresting him on false charges of various very spurious situations. Every time Tommy has been to court to defend himself, the state has lost. The police have been told where to go, with the exception of the mortgage fraud he was eventually done on. Hell, I'm 47. I would say that if you were to go through most people in their 40s or 50s, if you were to go through most people's background with a fine-tooth comb and the very, very fluid and manipulatable legal structure that we have in the United Kingdom, you could probably find a few skeletons in cupboards that you could at least maybe not jail somebody, but you could certainly make life very uncomfortable for them. Which makes the whole act of the police towards Tommy Robinson extremely sinister. So you have the middle classes and the educated classes silenced because they have too much to lose. And they really do have too much to lose. And I mean, we've seen this with Brexit. One of the reasons why the educated class are so anti-Brexit is because many of them work in companies and organizations where they actually personally have a lot to lose, and they don't see their loyalty to the nation state anymore. The European Union has done a great job of propagandizing against it. I don't want to go down that route though at the moment. I really want to focus on this this idea of why Amber Rudd is not defining the words far right or extremist. And the reason why is because the government doesn't want to actually jail people for 15 years. What they want to do is tell people to shut up, to silence people. And they do this by threatening people with a potential huge prison sentence, the sort of prison sentence you get for child rape, the sort of prison sentence you get for murder, the sort of prison sentence that you get for armed robbery where somebody gets shot. Okay? This is what you're talking about with 15 years in prison. So the point isn't to actually jail people for 15 years. The point is to have the threat hanging there. And by not defining what she means by far right or extremist, by not defining that, then it shuts people up. If you're a conservative like Brittany Pettibone or Lauren Southern, whose views I would say are, possibly more libertarian, or Lauren's anyway, than they are conservative with a C, then if they're being called far right by people who work for Amber Rudd, and I absolutely think that Amber Rudd made this decision, I think that it went all the way up, and she decided that they weren't getting into the country. She might not have done this over the weekend, but she certainly added their names to the list at some point. They are the ones of being accused of being far right. They're the ones being accused of being racist. And at one point, Brittany's even actually accused of being right wing. Well, I'm sorry, but Amber Rudd's meant to be a right wing politician. So what the bloody hell are her minions doing, banning somebody from the country for being right wing? So the implication to the general public is that if you hold views like Lauren or Brittany does, which are essentially traditional conservative views. I mean, we're not talking about national socialist views. We're not talking about Italian fascism. We're not talking about the racism of the British National Party. If you hold views like Lauren and Brittany does, then you are far right. And the Home Secretary said last October that you could go to prison for 15 years. Even if she's wrong and you're not far right, and they decide to arrest you for it, you've got to prove you're not far right. The Crown Prosecution Service, the Fiscal Service, supported by the police, will sit. They will grab you, and they will still put you through what Stalin's checker, what is the NKVD, the KGB, the OGPU used to call the conveyor, the system of criminal justice. In Stalin's day, it was beatings and torture, obviously, but in modern way, British way is a bit more sophisticated, but it's still got enormous consequences for your employment, financial security, future career, reputation, family relationships, and health. This is why my American cousins, my Canadian cousins, my Australian cousins, and my friends in Europe, this is why the British people are silent. In 2014, Paul Weston, leader of Liberty GB, which was a legitimate political party. It was registered with the Electoral Commission in Britain, and whose main aim was to campaign for a written constitution. He was arrested in Winchester High Street for quoting Winston Churchill's book, The Two Rivers. And in this book, the great man is highly critical of the impact that Islam has on a country and a people. He was reported by a member of the public when he was quoting this speech, and this was a speech he was giving as part of his election campaign, and he was arrested and charged with inciting racial hatred. Again, racial hatred, although it's against Islam. Now, if a leader of a legitimate political party who is campaigning for an election, which is why he's giving the speech in the street, can be arrested for quoting our greatest prime minister, arguably the man who saved Europe from the shadow of national socialism by making a stand in 1940, what chance does a normal British citizen have? What chance? And do you want to know what the really sad thing about all this is? The sword of Damocles threat, which silences us from standing up and speaking by using the threat of arrest and the clunky machinery of justice, and which has given organizations like human resources departments the power to fire people from their work for political opinions, which keeps us silent socially through the same social self-censorship that was suffered in the other parts of the world. And all this is this sort of Damocles, this threat that's hold our freedom of speech so fatally. Now, Theresa May, this is what I'd say to you. You and your fellow lawmakers are great ones for saying how we need to understand how this happened when you're referring to the terrible news that we've had from Telford, yet another town where girls of non-Muslim origin, whether they be white, Sikh, Hindu, have been industrially and systematically targeted by Pakistani Muslim men. 80% of these people are Pakistani Muslim men. Where these children have, and they're children, these aren't girls. I refuse to call them girls. They are children when they are targeted. We know that. It's all over the evidence from the cases. These children are addicted to drugs. They are fed alcohol. They are given money. They are impressed. Hell, anybody with a BMW, a wallet full of notes, and a bottle of champagne can impress a 12, 13-year-old girl. It's not hard, is it? And they are then caught in this trap whereby they are raped, threatened, trafficked, amongst others. It's just horrific. And the response of the powers to be is, how did this happen? We need to understand how this happens. How do we stop it? They don't understand why young British Muslims are so readily radicalised to pick up rifles and bombs. And they don't understand why there's an increasing anger in the British working classes, which they're terrified of exploding into the actual far-right violence that we haven't seen yet in this country. Okay, yes, we've seen a one-off attack and a few bits of a few cranks, but there's not been the sort of level of far-right carnage that we saw in Germany when the brown shirts started fighting back against the communists in the streets. So to deal with this, they spend millions on anti-radicalization strategies, which invariably, because of political correctness and the fear of mentioning the M word, gets spent on a prevent strategy, which is their name for it, which has, in one of its many glorious examples, been applied to a 17-year-old schoolboy activist for Leave the EU. A teacher who, obviously being a teacher, is completely indoctrinated as an ideological utopian of the left, reported him to the police for the prevent strategy because she felt that he'd been radicalized and had far-right views simply because he campaigned to leave the European Union. Now, Mrs. May, the tragedy of all this is that we already had a mechanism for putting a stop to the industrial scale of child abuse. We already had a superb system of preventing the rise of radicalization of British youths being wooed by the nihilism of jihad, Islamism, and the real far right. It didn't cost us anything, and we had 60-odd million British citizens to deliver it. This was called freedom of speech. We don't have it anymore, but we used to. Because this is an extremely elegant way of stopping radicalization, putting a stop to things like the industrial scale abuse we've seen. Because by having the ability to challenge ideologies and ideas in the open public forum of pubs, cafes, clubs, parks, workspaces, schools, colleges, universities, and indeed everywhere, by having the ability to question and challenge without fear of being arrested or causing offence, without fear of being fired for racially aggravated bullying, without the fear of being socially shunned by people either in real or digital life, we expose the ideas and ideologies that are fatal to our society and force those who advocate them to defend them with reason and logic. And if we don't do this, Prime Minister, if we don't do this, the ideas go unchallenged where they're allowed to ferment, fueled by perceived slight, by resentment, and stoked by the narrative of victimhood that prevails in our society today. Now, eventually, your powers of state might get around to confronting them in their ham-fisted and ineffective way. But wouldn't it be so much more elegant to trust the system our ancestors developed over hundreds of years and trust the British people, armed with the unrestricted freedom of speech, to ensure our citizens aren't radicalised to ensure our police and social services investigate crimes without fear of being fired or accused of racism. So, Mrs. May, if you want to put a stop to child abuse cases like Telford, to stop young people becoming Islamic or far-right terrorists, all you need to do is to restore freedom of speech by repealing the laws successive governments have introduced to destroy it. Laws that actually your predecessor David Cameron promised to look at repealing. By doing this, you will restore the culture of free speech, and people will once again grow the confidence to question ideas that don't sit right with their moral compass. As a conservative, you should distinctively understand that state-led initiatives are the very worst way to address a nation's problems, and you should instead trust the people. So, my friends, that is the difference over here. That is the problem. We have a government who are quite happy, a government, state and police force who are quite happy to use the clunky court system, to use the protection of common law and the process that has to be initiated to protect us using common law as a route of punishment to silence people, because the costs of speaking out are huge. I'm going to be making another video soon on how this happens in the workplace and how we're seeing an increasing number of people being fired and being thrown out of their jobs and their professions and their careers for wrongthink. I know a bit about this because my consultancy is a human resources practice, and I've seen over the last 10 to 15 years this culture of political correctness infesting human resources departments to such an extent now that in some organizations they spend tens of millions of pounds a year simply managing the fallout of this. Anyway, that's a topic for another occasion. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you found it valuable. Forgive me for the amateur nature of the video, and hopefully I'll see you all again soon. I very much welcome your comments below. Thank you.